Do Jews use special symbolism in personal, private, or non-liturgical rituals?
In addition to the ritual articles mentioned earlier, Jews use a number of important symbols while praying at home or for occasions such as weddings. During the observance of Passover, the kiddush, or blessing, cup is an important item. Some ritual sets designed for the Seder, order, ritual for Passover ceremony include a special Elijah cup set aside for the special guest, the prophet who may appear at any time. Some families are fortunate enough to own heirloom silver cups. Similar goblets are used in wedding ceremonies and in the ceremony that marks the separation. Havdalah, of Holy Sabbath time from the rest of the week. The Havdalah occurs Saturday evening at sundown to mark the end of the 24-hour period begun Friday at sundown. Jewish tradition measures all days this way. Also used in the latter is a small symbol called the spice tower that recalls a reference in Song of Songs to the safekeeping of precious spices. Traditional Jewish communities have produced magnificent illuminated pages called ketubah to recognize marriage vows. Typical decorations there include allusions to the temple and its implements in addition to scenes of domestic life. Amulets worn around the neck or suspended over an infant's cradle have been popular throughout Jewish history. Many are made of silver. A more elaborate and expensive amulet might include the tablets of the law along with a number of symbols of the temple, such as the menorah, incense burner, and ritual headdress of the high priest. A stylized hand in outline, used as a pendant or on a keychain, symbolizes divine protection and functions as an amulet.
What sort of symbols and signs will I see in a Hindu temple?
First, you will remove your shoes as a sign of respect for a holy place. And to help keep it clean, since worshippers often sit on the floor. Very near the door you will see an image or statue of the elephant-headed deity called Ganesha. One of Shiva's two sons, Ganesha is the guardian of openings, beginnings, and travelers, and he generally bestows blessings on worshippers as they enter. Even Vaishnavite temples usually have a Ganesha at the door. Along the side walls you may see smaller shrines containing images of deities important in one or another denomination but secondary to this particular temple's devotional focus. Straight ahead you will see the central shrine, perhaps flanked by a pair of subordinate shrines holding images of deities directly related to the one in the central shrine. For example, if the temple is primarily dedicated to a manifestation of Vishnu called Sri Venkateshvara, as are temples in Pittsburgh and St. Louis, flanking shrines might house Krishna and Radha on one side and Rama with wife Sita, brother Lakshmana, and the monkey assistant Hanuman on the other. The subordinate shrines may have prominent spires somewhat shorter than that of the central shrine. If the temple serves a large and diverse community, other side rooms may be devoted to other deities. Vishnu's consort, Lakshmi, goddess of wealth and success, often has her own shrine, sometimes with a shikhara, whose external elevation is slightly lower than those of the central shrine and its flanking shrines. Another room might house one large and several smaller shrines dedicated to Shiva and his holy family. In the main Shiva shrine you will see an abstract symbol of power and blessing called the Linga Yoni, the principal and iconic symbol of Shiva. Alongside, smaller shrines will display images of Parvati, Shiva's wife, and their two sons, Ganesha and Skanda, also known as Kartikeya and Murugan. Many, if not all, images will be elaborately clothed and festooned with floral garlands. Decorative themes on the shrines might include images of guardian figures called doorkeepers and other protective symbols that look like small lion faces.
Have there ever been any reform movements within Hinduism?
Since the early 19th century, various important reform movements have addressed the need to reinterpret ancient tradition for modern times. The Brahmo Samaj, Society of God, denounced the practice of widow suicide, sati, and promoted a monotheistic understanding of Hindu faith. Its successor organization, the Sadharan Brahmo Samaj, Universal Society of God, took aim at the caste system and looked for ways to update the tradition without having to resort to European ways of thinking. Some reformers, such as Ramankrishna, 1836–86, and his disciple Vivekananda, 1863–1902, offered fresh interpretations of both Bhakti and Vedanta that they hoped would appeal to the world beyond India. 20th-century successors to those pioneering reformers included Sri Aurobindo, 1872–1950, and Mahatma Gandhi, 1869–1948. Both studied in England and returned with distinctive views on how modern Hindus might revitalize their traditions. Sri Aurobindo proposed a form of modernist interpretation incorporating elements of European philosophy, and Gandhi emphasized simplicity of life and taught nonviolent means of political protest. Both men founded ashrams, quiet places in which spiritual seekers could find spiritual refuge.
Do Christians use statues or other similar imagery in worship?
Christian communities evidence a wide range of attitudes toward the use of visual imagery in the context of religious ritual or personal devotion. Some avoid it altogether, preferring all-white church decor and clear glass windows. At the other end of the spectrum are churches decorated with everything from stained glass to veritable galleries of statuary. Still others ornament their ritual spaces heavily, but use only two-dimensional images and no sculpture. Some of the earliest evidence comes from the 2nd and 3rd century. Catacombs in which worshippers sought refuge from their Roman persecutors. Early Christians at first seemed to limit their sacred imagery, using human figures for sacred personages other than Christ. Perhaps they felt Christ was too sacred to depict directly, or that representation violated the Jewish prohibition against graven images. In any case, they often used symbols such as the fish, or loaves of bread, or an empty cross. By the Middle Ages, Christians had developed extensive iconographic repertoires with which to depict an enormous array of holy personages. Elaborate programs in sculpture and stained glass depicted biblical figures. From patriarchs to kings to prophets, and saints, in addition to Jesus and Mary. Many sacred personages became associated with specific symbols as their identifying marks, such as St. Clement's anchor, he was martyred by drowning, tied to one. The crutch of the ascetic hermit Antony, and St. Ambrose's beehive, for his words were sweeter than honey. Some Protestant reformers vigorously opposed the use of images because of abuses associated with them, especially miracle-mongering. And as a result, this imagery is generally less common in Protestant churches today.
Has monasticism played a significant role in Christianity?
Since about the 3rd century, small numbers of Christian men and women have sought ways of dedicating themselves entirely to an intensified spiritual quest. At first, that quest typically took the form of a highly ascetic withdrawal from society. One of the earliest, and eventually most influential, of these hermits was Saint Anthony of Egypt. c. 250 to 350. Early in the 4th century, he decided to organize a community of fellow hermits. Later monastic founders also developed rules of common life. Pachomius, c. 290 to 346. Also of Egypt, is known as the true founder of communal or cenobitic monasticism. During his lifetime, there were 9 male and 2 female monasteries. Other important developments were the work of Benedict of Nursia, c. 480 to 550, whose rule became the basis of the worldwide order called the Benedictines, now including a number of women's orders as well as monks. Benedict himself was not an ordained priest, although nowadays the majority of Benedictine monks study for the priesthood. Other important monastic orders have been founded since, especially in medieval times. Major orders are the Franciscans, founded by Francis of Assisi, 1181 to 1226. With various sub-branches, and the Dominicans, founded by Dominic, 1170 to 1221. They are known as mendicant orders, since they were historically dependent on alms for monetary support. The Church of England also still sponsors several small monastic orders, such as the monks of St. John the Divine, and distinctive monastic communities, such as the Order of St. Basil the Great, continue to make important contributions to several of the Eastern churches.
What and where is Arabia?
The Arabian Peninsula is an enormous landmass that makes up the south-central portion of Western Asia, also known as the Middle East. It is now home to the nations of Saudi Arabia, Yemen, Oman, and United Arab Emirates, and several other small so-called Gulf states. Arabia is bordered on the west by the Red Sea, on the south by the Arabian Sea, and on the east by the Persian Gulf. Mostly desert, the peninsula is larger than Iran and Iraq combined, twice the size of Egypt, and about 10% larger than Alaska. Total population today is just over 20 million. Riyadh is the capital of Saudi Arabia, the peninsula's largest nation-state. Jeddah is the Red Sea port that serves the holy city of Mecca, Muhammad's hometown. Medina, the second holy city, is about 200 miles north of Mecca.
Is there a Deist or CCT creed?
Since religious Daoism and CCT emphasize practice over correct belief, they have not formulated the equivalent of creedal summaries such as those of Judaism, Islam, and even Buddhism. Daoism and CCT do, of course, presuppose certain basic beliefs and assumptions about how the world works. Most of those beliefs have to do with discerning and understanding how to cope with and benefit from the spiritual forces inherent in all things. All of the varieties of religious Daoism and CCT, therefore, have their core beliefs. But affirming one's assent to them pales in insignificance when compared to the importance of grasping the essential skills needed to negotiate life's daily challenges.
Is there a central teaching authority for Deists?
Individual Daoist sects, orders, and schools have regarded and in some cases still do regard their teaching office as a solemn and demanding role. But on the whole, Deists do not think of themselves as following any particular teaching or adhering to a particular orthodoxy. Even when important patriarchs, such as the living leader of the Celestial Masters School, have delivered formal pronouncements, relatively few Deists take notice. What is true of Daoism in this respect is even truer of the much more amorphous CCT. In neither case is any specific articulation of doctrine of any particular importance. Doctrinal standards are replaced here by pure tradition - the way we've always done things.
Has Daoism ever been associated with millennialism or messianic movements?
Several major movements of a millenarian and messianic cast have been associated with Daoism. One occurred during the late 2nd century CE under the leadership of the three Zhang brothers who claimed authority in the domains of heaven, earth, and humanity. They espoused a type of Daoism called Huang Lao, possibly a combination of the first parts of the names of Huang Di, the Yellow Emperor, and Lao Zi, and claimed divine origins for their eschatologically charged sacred text, the highest peace scripture. The brothers Zhang established a theocracy, complete with elaborate hierarchies. Toward the end of the 2nd century the movement swelled into full-scale rebellion led by a military force called the Yellow Turbans. The rebellion fizzled even though its leaders considered 184 CE an ideal time, beginning as it did a fresh 60-year cycle. Shortly after that ill-fated rebellion in the east, another Zhang from an unrelated family organized a theocratic state that lasted from 186 to 216 CE. This Zhang Lu claimed the authority of his grandfather Zhang Daoling, 34 to 156 CE. Traditionally cited as the founder of the first Daoist religious movement, the Celestial Masters School. Both theocracies hoped to re-establish the utopian regimes they believed had existed in the past. After the 4th century, new and more powerful movements emerged, with various leaders claiming to be incarnations of a divinized Lao Zi, called Li Heng. All taught the expectation of a messiah and a final battle which only the elect would survive, to live on in their religious utopia. None had long-term repercussions. Loosely related by symbolism to the Yellow Turban Rebellion of 184 was the typing, highest peace. Rebellion of 1850 to 64. It was a syncretistic movement that borrowed heavily from Christian millennialist imagery.
Do Confucians pray in any particular language?
Most people who still actively pursue the teachings attributed to Confucius are of Chinese descent. Relatively small numbers of Confucians live in Korea and Japan, and the rest are scattered across the globe, mostly in communities of Chinese origin. Many dialects, some very different from each other, are spoken across China. When people gather, for example, in Taipei's Confucian Temple, they naturally perform their rituals in the Taiwanese dialect. That is not to say that they all can or do read the 5 classics and 4 books themselves. Those texts are written in an archaic language difficult even for well-educated native speakers of Chinese. In Japan and Korea, Confucians who engage in ancestor veneration ceremonies at a public Confucian venue will use their vernacular languages. Japanese and Korean Confucian scholars, on the other hand, must be able to handle the sources in Chinese. In other words, although Chinese dialects are canonical in that the Confucian tradition's primary sources were written in them, Chinese is not a sacred liturgical language as Sanskrit and Arabic still are for Hindus and Muslims.
Do Muslims believe in predestination or fatalism?
A common misperception of Islamic tradition is that God exercises such minute and perfect control over all things that human actions have no bearing on the individual's ultimate destiny. When Muslims use the expression God willing, they do not mean to suggest that human beings are mere marionettes dancing at the whim of the divine puppeteer. They are simply reminding themselves that God is ultimately in charge of everything, regardless of individual human preferences. True, the Quran often describes how God both guides and leads astray whomever He chooses. But that does not suggest that God is capricious or spiteful. Only that God is God and that lesser beings ought not to take God's sovereignty for granted even for a second. Equally often, the Quran reminds believers how God lays out His signs in creation and in the individual heart. Adding, perhaps you will understand. Muslims believe in God's justice. The Quran insists that each person will be held accountable for his or her actions at judgment. But since God is just, Muslims conclude that human beings exercise a significant freedom of choice otherwise. Accountability at the judgment would be a sham, a cruel hoax to which God hardly needs to resort. All in all, Muslim tradition seeks to maintain the delicate balance between belief in God's absolute power and a limited, but more than adequate, human freedom to choose either good or evil.
Is there such a thing as Jewish fundamentalism?
Fundamentalist approaches to scriptural interpretation and to the conduct of life in general have been an ongoing reality in Jewish tradition and history. As far back as the last few centuries BCE, groups like the Sadducees and Karaites had rejected any traditional developments beyond the written scripture, going so far as to reject even scriptural texts apart from the Torah. In more recent times, a number of arch-conservative groups have asserted themselves, especially in Israel. The Gush Emunim or Bloc of the Faithful, for example, represent the concerns of a number of Israelis who have settled in the occupied West Bank, which is now part of negotiations with the Palestinian Authority. Jewish fundamentalism in this and other cases turns largely on a given group's literal insistence that the land is a divine and irrevocable gift, and must therefore be reclaimed and occupied by whatever means necessary.
What are some of the main varieties of Shinto officials or specialists?
Shinto tradition refers to the priesthood in general as either Shinzoku or Kanishi. Larger shrines with full priestly staffs distinguish among a number of ranks. The chief priest is called the Guji, generally the highest-ranking local official. Guji might have oversight of up to 30 subordinate shrines. The Gonguji is second in command and oversees a staff of several lower ranks as well. including junior assistant chief priests, Shingonguji. Senior priests are called neki, assistant senior priests gon-neki, and regular priests. Shutten or kyujo, fill out the ranks of male staff. A national ranking system also distinguishes among priests by acknowledging their levels of learning with the equivalent of academic degrees, named purity, jokai, brightness, maikai, righteousness, sekai, and uprightness, chakai. Young unmarried women, called shrine maidens, maiko, function rather like deaconesses. Dressed in striking vermilion skirts and white blouses. They assist in blessing rituals, run the shrine shop, and perform sacred dance. Maiko traditionally begin their association with the shrine and training for service as sacred children. Highest in rank is the unique position called Saishu, found only at the ISE shrine and held by a woman. She is an imperial princess with the symbolic title Master of the Matsuri, festivals. Assisting her is a priest with the rank of Daiguji, Great Chief Priest, a function unique to ISE. In the imperial household, ritual specialists have either of two ranks. The shoten parallels the shrine rank of senior priest. The shoten-ho that of assistant senior priest. But the emperor himself or a personal delegate presides. Much as the Chinese sovereign once did, at over 24 annual ceremonies.
How and where do members of local Muslim communities come together?
When small local communities of Muslims begin to form in new locations. They typically begin by meeting in each other's homes for social and religious purposes. As their numbers grow, they need to look for a space large enough to accommodate them. In many American cities, for example, Muslims have acquired everything from former storefront buildings to former Christian churches. There they will remain until further growth and financial success permit more ambitious options, such as acquiring a piece of property, having it zoned properly, and building a dedicated facility. Whatever the venue in which they gather for prayer. Muslims call that place a masjid, a place of prostration. The word mosque is rooted in the medieval Spanish pronunciation of masjid. Technically, one needs no specific place for the prostration of ritual prayer. Every place is a mosque. So long as one hallows the space and orients it toward Mecca. But community growth and the requirement of coming together on Fridays for a congregational prayer have made the institution known as the mosque a common sight all over the world, and increasingly in the United States as well. There are now more than 1,000 mosques across the country. Most mosque communities eventually develop a full complement of governing, advisory, and functional committees, with emphasis on a fairly egalitarian form of governance.
What is the relationship between Judaism and Christianity?
If all the non-Christian religions, Judaism holds a unique place in the history of salvation. The Old Testament records the history of the Jews, and it shows how God chose them in a special way and revealed himself to them. God entered into a covenant with Abraham and, through Moses, with the people of Israel. He taught them to acknowledge him as the one living and true God. When Jesus Christ came among humanity, he came as a Jew. Those Jesus chose as apostles were Jews. Most of the early disciples were Jews. Thus the beginnings of the Christian faith were already found among the Jewish patriarchs, Moses, and the prophets. There is a spiritual bond, then, that links Christians with Jews.
What were the earliest Buddhist sacred texts?
For several centuries the Buddhist community preserved the treasure of the Buddha's teachings orally. Monks and devout laypersons memorized increasingly formulaic versions of what the Buddha had said and the way he had behaved. As the community of monks became more stable, settling for longer periods in fixed residences, the practice of communal recitation of the sacred words became the primary mechanism for maintaining the teachings intact. Any error in recitation could be corrected immediately to ensure uniformity and, it was believed, perfect accuracy. Local communities recited the text in their own vernaculars, since no one sacred language had been decreed. Earliest texts were organized into three major groupings or baskets: Pitaka. 1, called the Vinyapitaka, contained all the rules of monastic discipline. Another gathered the Buddha's speeches, the Sutra Pitaka, and a third, much later, text included 7 lengthy theoretical interpretations of the Buddha's teaching, the Abhidharma Pitaka. At a gathering called the Third Council in 250 BCE, members agreed on the first official formulation of all three baskets as a single scripture called the Tripitaka in a northeastern Indian language called Pali. Monks continued to keep the texts alive almost exclusively through memory for perhaps another century or so. Finally, the sacred texts were systematically committed to writing and became the basis of what is now known as the Pali Canon.
How does Jewish tradition interpret history?
Large portions of the Hebrew scriptures are some of the finest ancient historical writing. Authors of historical texts in the Bible do not merely catalog events chronologically. They evaluate their data and pass judgment on the main characters from a particular perspective that views all happenings as part of a greater divine plan. They discern patterns in human behavior and in God's ways of dealing with people. So, for example, the author of the book of Judges observes how, when the people do evil in the sight of God, God allows them to suffer the consequences. Once they've had enough chaos, they cry out to God for help. God then raises up a judge to rule the people, and justice reigns for 40 or 80 years. But when the strong ruler dies, the people again go astray, and the cycle starts again. Judges 2:16-23. History begins when God creates time and space, moves through many generations of human beings struggling with and for each other, and will come to an apocalyptic conclusion at a time known only to God. Above all, history is the arena in which God deals actively with humankind as a whole, but directs both special attention and expectation to the children of Israel.
What is the religion on the silver screen?
Ben-Hur, 1959. The third film version of the Lew Wallace classic stars Charlton Heston in the role of a Palestinian Jew battling the Roman Empire at the time of Christ. The breathtaking chariot race is spectacularly conceived and filmed. The Bible, in the beginning, 1966. Brings to life the book of Genesis, including the stories of Adam and Eve, Cain and Abel, and Noah and the flood. All-star cast includes George C. Scott, Richard Harris, Stephen Boyd, Peter O'Toole, and Ava Gardner. David and Bathsheba. 1951, the Bible story comes alive in a lush and colorful production starring Gregory Peck and Susan Hayward. El Cid, 1961. Charts the life of Rodrigo Diaz de Bivar, known as El Cid, who was the legendary 11th century Christian hero who freed Spain from Moorish invaders. A man for all seasons. 1966, heavily Oscar-honored biographical drama concerning the life and subsequent martyrdom of Sir Thomas More, 16th century Chancellor of England. Paul Scofield's performance as More is considered one of the greatest ever of its kind. The Ten Commandments. 1956, Cecil B. DeMille's remake of his 1923 silent classic is a lavish epic about the life of Moses, who turned his back on a privileged life to lead his people out of bondage in Egypt. The sequence depicting the parting of the Red Sea is considered to rival any modern special effects.
Who are some important female deities?
Amaterasu, the sun goddess, is the most important of the goddesses. Hundreds of shrines throughout Japan are dedicated to her. One of the most colorful goddesses is Ama no Uzume, the terrible female of heaven. Widely popular because of her identification with frivolity and dance. A kami described as both masculine and feminine is Inari, because of her association with rice harvest. Inari is among the most important deities. Her messenger is the fox, and popular custom often refers to the fox itself as Inari. Bright reddish orange or red torii gates. Sometimes in great numbers, usually mark shrines dedicated to Inari. A pair of goddesses associated with the war kami Hachiman appear in a sculptural triad with Hachiman. One is called Nikitsuhime, but the other remains to be identified. Seiryu Gongjin was one of several goddesses adopted by Shinto in their role as protectors of Buddhist temples. Two other imported goddesses with Buddhist connections are Zenmyo-nyoshin and Byakuko-shin. Stories tell of how a Korean monk fell in love with Zenmyo while he was studying in China. Byakuko was once an Indian earth deity who became a Shinto kami through her associations with powers of nature. Goddesses like Kumino Fusumai Okamai are often depicted round and full to suggest abundance. Goddess Tamiyuri Hime appears in a triad, flanked by two other goddesses. Once worshipped as the three protectresses of children. Tamayori was the daughter of Wadatsumai no Kami, Kami of the oceans, and Japan's first emperor's mother. Benten, also called Benzaiten, is a goddess of Indian origin. Hindus know her as Sarasvati, consort of the god Brahma and patroness of culture. She plays the Japanese lute, called the biwa, as Sarasvati plays the veena. And devotees beseech her for protection and for gifts of eloquence and knowledge. Numerous female kami have played important roles in Shinto life over the centuries. And some were frequently depicted in human form, but only a few remain significant in contemporary devotion.
Do Vaishnavites have special feasts in honor of Vishnu or his avatars?
Rama Navami, Rama 9th, during Chaitra in early spring, celebrates Rama's birthday. During a 9-day festival, celebrants attend a lengthy retelling of the massive epic Ramayana. A related feast occurs on the 15th of Shravan, a full moon celebration of Rama's crossing over to Lanka to rescue Sita. Two major feasts focus on Krishna. Krishna Janmashtami, birthday. 8th during the dark half of Shravan, in late summer, celebrates Krishna's birthday. For a full 7 days, devotees reenact events from Krishna's life. The festivities culminate with a fast and midnight worship on the 7th day, the eve of the birthday. Naga Panchami, Serpent 5th, so named because it occurs on the 5th day of Shravan's bright half. Comes in late summer and recalls one of Krishna's many victories over embodiments of evil. His dispatching of the serpent demon Kaliya in the river Jumna. Although the evil demon in this case is a serpent. The fast and feast celebrate the grace represented by other cosmically beneficial serpents as well. Several feasts also recall other specific avatars. For example, on the full moon of Kartika, some Vaishnavites celebrate Vishnu's descent as the Savi or fish Matsya.
What are some of the main varieties of Daoist officials or specialists?
Since about the 4th century CE, religious specialists called Daoshi, masters of the Dao, have led Daoist communities at prayer. These leaders can be celibate monks. There are also nuns called Daogu, who live almost exclusively in monastic communities. Monastic priests, mostly members of the Complete Realization Order, occasionally perform public rituals. But, not unlike cloistered monks in some other traditions, their principal focus is on their more private spiritual pursuits. Some ritual specialists are married family men who live near a monastery. These so-called lay masters, Qigong, make up the majority of Daoist ritual specialists. Individuals generally specialize in certain types of ritual, such as exorcism and faith healing. Among the non-monastic, those ritualists whose functions most closely resemble those of priests in various other traditions are called the Black Hats. Many of them belong to the Celestial Masters school, perhaps the oldest of all Daoist organizations. In addition to the Black Hats, the official and intricately trained priests, there are the red turbans known as Fashi, specialists in the occult. Black Hats, so called because of their small mandarin cap with a gold knob on top, are authorized to perform both the greater festivals and the more ordinary ceremonies to which the red turbans are restricted. The two groups are alternatively known as blackheads and redheads. Specialists of earlier times called libationers in the Celestial Masters school had the triple duty of religious instruction, local administration, and ritual leadership. Not unlike the typical parish pastor in many Christian denominations.
Are martyrs simply crazy? Are they masochists?
Some, perhaps. A few may not have been authentic witnesses for faith but may have been acting out serious personal problems or merely calling attention to themselves. And in some instances, social pressure is the operative force, making it impossible for certain people not to participate. That too can result in a grotesque distortion of the ideal of committed witnessing. Real martyrs don't necessarily want to die, much less are they possessed by a mania for death.
What are the Islamic rituals of marriage? Do Muslims favor arranged marriages?
In the United States, Muslim nuptials, called nikah in Arabic, can occur in the prayer hall of the local mosque in a separate ceremony not connected with the regular ritual prayer. In other places, weddings typically occur in homes or in the presence of a Muslim judge, called a qadi. The imam of the mosque, or the judge, presides over the ceremony and may offer religious reflections on the sacredness of the marriage contract. In some countries, elaborate processions and housewarming ceremonies are part of the festivities. As in many other traditions, two witnesses attest to the agreement. Written documentation includes both mosque records and the usual license required by civil law. A reception called a walima, pronounced walima, follows weddings nearly everywhere. In some countries, the bridal dowry remains an essential item in the social contract between families. Many Muslim families continue to prefer marriages in which the parents do the initial negotiating. They present their favored prospect to their son or daughter. But in most situations the young people have the option of declining. Many Muslims regard open dating as undesirable and believe the arranged relationship is healthier and more acceptable morally. Some parents will even take out ads, especially on behalf of a daughter, in the personal sections of Muslim publications, seeking interested parties who are well educated and religiously committed.
What is a Tao Tai mask?
One of the most common and important visual motifs in the arts associated with Confucian and Cit ritual objects is the mask known as the Tao Tai mask. Visit your local museum's Asian galleries and head for the cases that display the Chinese bronzes. Around the main part of the body of the object you will probably see what appear to be eyes and mouth arranged along a vertical that could very well be a nose. Look more closely and a face, like that of a large cat, will begin to emerge from the patterns of the rich design. Look again, this time examining the design on each side of the central vertical, and you may see what appear to be a pair of dragons rearing up toward each other. These mesmerizing designs have long fascinated art historians. The name Tao Tai means ogre or glutton, a name given to the motif perhaps because it suggests the visage of bottomless hunger capable of devouring all in its path. This terrifying apparition probably represents a deity from the ancient Shang dynasty pantheon. Its presence on the sacred ritual vessels is a protective device to safeguard the contents of the vessel. The Tao Tai disappeared from the Chinese decorative repertoire around 1000 BCE. But its early prominence and striking visual power make it a superb example of deep-rooted religious symbolism.
Do Buddhist communities run private religious schools?
In some parts of the world, traditional Buddhist religious education remains important. In Southeast Asia and Sri Lanka, for example, devout Buddhists still send their children for instruction in the local monastery. Nearly half of Thailand's primary schools are those of the local Wats or temples. And some monks travel to other schools to teach. Adults may also attend classes, lectures, and educational sermons. Monks naturally get their core religious training within the monastery's own educational structure. But skill in means requires that an effective person know how to put that learning into action. Some Thai universities have developed special curricula designed to aid the monks in their wider ministry. They can take courses in a range of socially oriented subjects and skills, including public health and hygiene, food preparation, construction of roads and bridges, temple and village organizing, agricultural development, and conflict resolution.
Have there been any other sub-communities or denominations within Daoism?
Dozens of other schools and sects have arisen over the long history of religious Daoism. The Great Purity School, Shangqing, also known as Mount Mao. Maoshan, Daoism, arose during the late 4th century. The Shangqing claims as its central revelation a set of scriptural texts in over 30 volumes. Almost contemporary in origin with that school is another called the Lingbao. It also claims a distinctive scriptural revelation, based in part on the Shangqing scripture. Heavenly Mind, Tianxin, Daoism, emphasizing the importance of exorcism and based also on its own scriptural revelation, began in the late 10th century. The Divine Highest Heaven, Shenxiao, school, dating from the 12th century, is best known for its talismans of legendary potency and its elucidation of correspondences between the microcosm of the body and the macrocosm of the universe. Great Oneness, Taiyi, Daoism, also from the 12th century, was a celibate monastic school important for its integration of Confucian and Buddhist elements. Though none of these schools remains active today, all have made significant historical contributions to the large and complex reality called Daoism.
In brief, what is the history of religious Daoism?
Religious Daoism emerged as a recognizable tradition in its own right during the latter decades of the Han Dynasty, 202 BCE to 221 CE. Confucianism enjoyed imperial favor as the official creed of the state. But when the Han Dynasty disintegrated, both Daoism and Buddhism found room to grow. The early Celestial Masters school dominated the Daoist scene for the most part. Various schools teaching forms of alchemical Daoism developed early on and have continued throughout the past 2,000 years. In addition, new revelations claimed by various teachers gave rise to several new schools between the 3rd and 6th centuries, times of political fragmentation. See below for discussion of individual schools and denominations. With political reunification during the Sui, 581 to 618, dynasty, Daoism's various schools managed to survive in spite of meager imperial support. Many monasteries flourished but remained apart from the general populace. Things improved under the Tang dynasty, 618 to 906, when Daoists once again had friends in high places. Under the Song dynasty, 960-1279, Neo-Confucianism proved a powerful rival for Daoists at court. But Daoists fared well anyway, since many Neo-Confucians gladly exchanged ideas with Daoism's leading lights. During the Southern Song dynasty, 1127 to 1279. In spite of an almost complete lack of public imperial patronage, several new Daoist schools sprang up. Things took a turn for the worse under the Yuan dynasty, 1260 to 1368. Deists invited to participate in court debates suffered serious setbacks and paid dearly with the loss of monasteries and precious libraries. During the late medieval Ming dynasty, 1368 to 1644, Deist fortunes improved again dramatically and many Deist masters enjoyed prominent official positions. But under the last of the imperial regimes, the Qing, or Manchu, dynasty, 1644 to 1911, the pendulum swung the other way and religious Daoism struggled to survive the early modern period. Through the periods of the First Chinese Republic, 1912 to 1949, and the People's Republic, 1949 to present, Daoism has held on largely thanks to the establishment of several organizations designed to provide a public presence for the various orders and schools. After disastrous losses as a result of the Cultural Revolution, 1966 to 76, Daoist religious groups are again struggling to pull themselves back together.
Is there a system of Confucian or CIT religious law?
Confucian tradition's closest analogy to the kind of religious regulation important to Jews and Muslims, for example, are the canons of ritual. It may sound at first as though Confucian law is limited to what are sometimes called rubrics. Rubrics are instructions on how to perform a ceremony, that take their name from the Latin for red because the directions are printed in red ink to set them off from the liturgical text. But what Confucians mean by the canons of ritual actually includes an enormous range of human behavior. Here the Confucian scholars have codified ways of acting for every age and station in life. From members of the ordinary household, to the servant who prepares fruit for the emperor, to the emperor himself. These often elaborate and even somewhat theatrical stipulations might strike the outsider as extreme or downright compulsive. But the traditional interpretation is that a person of cultivated virtue will always act in such as way as to express precisely his or her relationship to those with whom he is dealing. In this way Confucian tradition preserved a definite social hierarchy still very much reflected in the formal language usage of Korea and Japan, as well as of China. Because of its unique relationship to the civil authority represented by the emperor, Confucianism as such, with its 5 classics and 4 books, did not develop a specific code of penal law. That was still largely the province of the literati as royal administrators. But it emanated from the imperial household and developed over many centuries.
What is meant by the term covenant?
Covenant, berith in Hebrew, describes better than perhaps any other single notion the essential quality of God's relationship to humankind. Discussion of divine initiatives that result in the sealing of a covenantal bond appears early in the Torah and continues through the prophetic books. Covenants were a crucial social cement in many ancient Near Eastern societies, including Israel. Partners in a covenant need not be equal in status and power. Many covenants described between human partners in the Bible are between a lord or ruler and his vassals. A more or less common formula for these lord-vassal relationships evolved. This covenant treaty form typically began with a section in which the lord names himself in relation to the vassal or subject. A brief historical summary recalls all the good things the Lord has provided. That is followed by a list of blessings that will accrue to the subject who is faithful, and the curses that will befall one who is lax or breaks the covenant. Some elements of the treaty form, as well as of the treaty lawsuit the Lord might bring against one who violated the agreement, appear here and there in the Hebrew Bible. Accounts of major covenants between God and his people include those with Noah, Genesis 6 and 9. Marked by the appearance of the rainbow and the cessation of destruction by flood, Abraham, Genesis 15 to 17. Sealed by the sign of circumcision, and Moses at Sinai, Exodus 19 to 24, embodied in the revealed law. At various points in the historical and prophetic books we hear of covenant renewals. A leader, such as Joshua, calls the people to account for their past behavior, and challenges them to reaffirm their allegiance to God, the sovereign. Joshua 24 is a fascinating example of how some elements of the ancient treaty formula apparently survived in the practice of Israel. King David's rule is also marked by a covenant renewal led by the court prophet Nathan, 2 Samuel 7. Prophets, such as Jeremiah, spiritualize the notion of covenant, saying that God wishes to inscribe the special relationship on the tablets of their hearts, Jeremiah 33.
Who is the Antichrist?
Antichrist is the generic title given to an individual, organization, or principle of evil believed to represent all that runs counter to the values of Jesus Christ. Only the two letters of John use the term, referring to people who refuse to believe in the Incarnation. Some early Christians labeled Roman emperors antichrists because of their opposition to the faith. Some Protestant groups occasionally have dubbed the Pope the Antichrist. Similarly, some Muslims today characterize any external enemy as the Great Satan. Christians throughout history have identified as the Antichrist the various evil forces of which the Book of Revelation speaks, including Rome and the beasts whose appearance will signal the apocalypse. Perhaps the most common and persistent view is that at the end of time, Jesus, in his second coming, will confront and vanquish an impostor who claims to be Christ, i.e., the Antichrist, but not before the impostor has managed to lure many believers from the faith.
What do Hindus believe about ultimate spiritual reality or God?
Hindu conceptions about God are among the most expansive and arresting in the history of religion. Scores of names and forms make up the enormous Hindu theological lexicon. Some names and forms emphasize divine majesty and power, others divine beauty and attractiveness. For Hindus generally, the purpose of religious belief and devotion is to cultivate a relationship with the holy, the source of benevolence and blessing as well as of death and difficulty. Most of all, God is a mystery that is willing to be unveiled. Hindu theologians define two broad ways of talking about the God. Ultimate reality, called Brahman in Sanskrit. God is beyond all imagining and impossible to shoehorn into humanly devised words and concepts. But believers can still refer to the ultimate reality in a roundabout way, hinting at what God is by saying explicitly what God is not. From this perspective, theologians call the God Brahman without qualities, Nirguna Brahman. But the negative way of thinking about God can be very abstract and difficult. Human beings generally need something more concrete. Something that engages the feelings and imagination as well as the logic-bound mind. Hindu tradition therefore acknowledges that one can approach the truth by considering God as Brahman with qualities, Guna Brahman. In this approach, one has always to keep in mind that those qualities are remote approximations at best, and ultimately just a concession to the human need to imagine the unimaginable.
Is there a Jewish ritual of marriage?
Many readers will be familiar with the Jewish custom of having the groom standing with the bride under a canopy. The huppah shatter a wine glass with his foot at the conclusion of wedding ceremonies. The symbolic act is meant to help people keep in mind the seriousness of marriage, and perhaps even to recall the destruction of the temple. The whole ceremony is called kiddushin, the sanctification. Taking place in almost any kind of public space, including a synagogue, it begins with a procession. The ritual is largely up to the couple and their families, along with the rabbi presiding, and is not dictated by traditional text or established rubrics. A reception typically follows, often with a blessing before and after the meal.
Did Daoist tradition spread beyond China?
Daoism has exerted some influence at various times all over East and Southeast Asia. Wherever Chinese have traveled, Daoism has gone and left its mark. But it rarely has made its presence felt dramatically outside of China and territories under Chinese control. Daoist teachings, however, have had a significant impact on Chinese Buddhism over the centuries. Buddhism in turn has transported those usually well hidden contributions on its missionary road throughout Asia. In relatively recent times, Daoism, and teachings that claim to be Daoist, have begun to enjoy increasing popularity in Europe and the Americas, but on a much smaller scale than other traditions of Asian origin.
What was the earliest Daoist sacred text?
First and most influential of the Daoist sacred texts is the Dao De Jing, classic of the Way and its power. Traditionally attributed to Lao Zi, the text actually dates from between 300 and 250 BCE. Authorship and immediate historical context remain uncertain. Its attribution to the Old Master may have arisen out of a desire to lend the text greater legitimacy and credibility. The Dao De Jing's 81 tantalizing short poems brim with paradox. As they try to describe the indescribable by saying what it is not. Just as the value of a cup is the emptiness within, so the way progresses by, apparently, going backwards. As all of nature acts without conscious effort, so the person who strives in hope of gain loses all. The curiously attractive teaching of the Dao De Jing emphasizes the way of utter simplicity. Divided into two parts, poems 1 to 37 focus on the way. Poems 38 to 88 on its power. Some describe the way as the passive principle and its power as primal spiritual energy. Anyone who tries to define the way must know that it remains indefinable. Dao is the source of all energy but eludes discovery. Imperceptible yet irresistible, impersonal yet ever-present, the Dao's power is like that of water. The softest of all elements inevitably dissolves the hardest. Although the text may sometimes give the impression that it favors the more mysterious female yin over the male yang. That is perhaps a result of its need to counter prevalent social biases. In the end, life can proceed only with a perfect balance of yin and yang. Mountain and valley, light and dark, dry and moist, evident and hidden.
How do Daoists view their traditions' relationships to other traditions?
By the beginning of the first millennium, philosophically minded Daoists had rubbed elbows for several centuries with proponents of a cultural and ethical system often identified as Confucian. Together the Confucians and the Daoists were increasingly important elements of a larger cultural matrix. Religion, for which they had as yet no specific term, was a blend of ancient divinatory rites, ancestor veneration, exorcism, and offerings meant to secure blessings and protection from heaven and several other fairly generic and non-personal divine powers. Religious Daoism evolved during the period when Buddhism was taking root in China. It was not until Chinese Buddhism was several centuries old that Chinese thinkers began to talk of three ways of being both Chinese and religious. It is as though the Chinese people had not thought of their ancient traditions as anything but the way things are, rather like the air they breathed, until an imported form of thinking and acting called the way of the Buddha entered the scene. Buddhist-Daoist relations have had a checkered history. At first many Daists regarded Buddhism as a new Daist school or sect. Thanks to Buddhist efforts at translating key concepts into terms Daists would understand. Before long, full-scale hostility developed when Daists began to think of the missionary-minded Buddhists as a threat. Confucians often sided with Daists in condemning Buddhism as un-Chinese. Periods of persecution of Buddhists alternated with rich interchange and mutual influence. Since the 1800s, Daist-Buddhist relations have been much more stable and peaceful, so that many Chinese now perceive few or no important distinctions or barriers between the two traditions. CCT has been a kind of meeting ground. As for Daist-Confucian relations, there has been intermittent rivalry for imperial patronage. The two traditions share a great deal in the way of broad doctrinal and cultural themes, such as the so-called yin/yang worldview and ancestor veneration. During the Confucian revival of the 12th and 13th centuries, a development often dubbed Neo-Confucianism, there was renewed positive interaction and mutual exchange of ideas. Nowadays, relations remain generally cordial, but without much substantial discussion of core belief.